All right, we are on air. It is Thursday, January 22nd. Every Thursday here is Backdrop Day, so it's pretty exciting. Today is our first Backdrop status meeting after the release of Backdrop 1.0, so everybody's really excited about that. Nate is not here today, unfortunately. I was hoping he would come join us later, but we'll see. He might not make it by the end of the meeting. So we can all celebrate in his absence, and then I'll tell him how much fun he missed. So that's the plan. So let's see. Obviously, the big news is that Backdrop 1.0.0 was released last Thursday. I think we did it around 11:30. After the meeting, we had two release blockers that we were working on that just involved merging in all of the latest things from Drupal 7. So any changes that gotten into Drupal 7 recently, we wanted to make sure we're in Backdrop 1 before we released. We also then decided to rearrange all of the files, which made Nate really nervous. But I wanted to make sure that like all of the CSS files were in CSS directories and all the JavaScript files were in JavaScript directories. And he's like, every time you move the JavaScript, something could break, and like we don't have automated testing on JavaScript. And I'm like, it'll be fine. I'll just test it. So he's sitting there going, this is a bad idea. This is a bad idea. But I tested the snot out of it. He pushed it in. It seemed to be working. And he's like, okay. And he released it. And he's like, I'm never letting you talk me into this again. But it worked out fine. We did a bunch of testing after the fact, and all of the problems that we had over the weekend were not related to moving files around. So bad idea, though it may have been, we somehow succeeded. So I'm so excited that we got it out. Files were in a great order. We did, of course, release, and then all weekend long, everybody started using it, and we came up with a whole bunch of bugs, which is kind of what we were expecting. But the most amazing thing to me was that I was going through doing stuff, and I would create an issue on Drupal.org and say, oh, I found a problem, and then I would go back to fix it like an hour later, and it was already fixed. Like, this is so amazing. And Nate's like, why are you creating all of these issues? You're just mucking up the issue queue. It was nice and clean, and now we've got like 100 extra issues. And I'm creating extra issues so we don't forget. But it turned out I was creating extra issues so other people could fix them. So that was fabulous. So we created a milestone for 1.0.1, tagged all of the issues that were bug fixes for that release, and we got all of them done over the weekend, which was fabulous. And then we were able to schedule that release for Tuesday night, and we went through and found a couple of minor things early in the week, and we released 1.0.1 bug fix release right away. And it was kind of thing where it wasn't really that urgent to get that first bug fix release out, but we wanted to test our process. And one of the things that was broken was the administration menu settings page, and for some reason, even though in the real world nobody ever goes to that page on their sites, when you're testing the product, it's one of the top links, and so it was something that almost everyone landed on and noticed that it was broken. So it was like, well, even though it's not a really big problem, it's a really ugly error, so we should probably get that fixed out so that as people start testing it, that won't be their first impression of Backdrop. So we released 1.0.1, and then after we got that first bug fix released out, we practiced the process of pushing the upstream release to Pantheon and making sure that you got a little warning on your Pantheon dashboard telling you that there was a new version of Backdrop, and then you run the merge on Pantheon and everything got fixed, which was great. So we have our process of pushing updates sorted out. But then, of course, after we pushed the update, we instantly discovered two more problems that are related to pushing updates. So we'll probably do another really quick iteration on fixing those bugs and then trying to get another bug release out pretty soon too. Again, not urgent because the first update did not require a database update. The second update might. So I think as long as we get this fixed in with the next version, we should be fine. So, yay, Backdrop is out, Backdrop 1.01 at this point. We've gotten a whole bunch of really great feedback from people who've been using it. We've gotten a ton of brand new contributed module authors or porters. We've got a ton of requests in the queue for more people who are working on it. There's a bunch of really good buzz on Twitter. People are writing blog posts about it. I think our guesses were correct that people wanted this thing. So I'm really excited that it actually looks like we were right. So it was a little, it's always a little nerve-wracking there. So yay. I talked to Matt last night. He said we've got about 125 sites on Pantheon. So that includes, people who just clicked the button to try it and see, but also people who are developing sites. So he says in various stages of development, which is great. I think for the first week that is fabulous. Who knows how many other people have installed it locally. So I think we're doing pretty well. So in terms of what's coming next, we will have another patch release to fix the problems that we found in the update process. And then, of course, any other bugs that we find between now and then, we'll try and get in that fix too. But there's nothing super urgent, so I think that's really good. And then our next minor release is going to be on May 15th. And we've got a couple of things that we've got scheduled for that. So that will be, ideally, we'll get Path Auto and Token in core for that next release. On our wish list is also to get CK Editor or a rich text editor in core by then too. That's a lot of work to do in the next 4 months, but we're going to give it a shot. We've already got initial ports of Token and Path Auto that they both need a bunch of work, which I think is a good point. I mean, we didn't do those, someone else did. Someone came into the community and was like, I ported these modules, which is amazing first start, so we'll start there. CK Editor, I think, is going to be the trickiest part. We'll see how much of it we can get in the first pass. We might have to hold off on stuff like inline image handling until the next minor release, but I think getting something at all in there is better than nothing right away. So that's our plan. There's some other stuff that is less urgent that we want to get in that release too. Things like a new administration theme or maybe a new look and feel for the current one. We still have technically to figure out which way we want to handle that. But we've got a lot on our list, so we'll see. We'll see how far we get. I rearranged the agenda a little bit since our last weekly meeting so that we could talk about things that we needed that are not Backdrop, because we've been spending a ton of time on all of the stuff we need to do in Backdrop. And now that Backdrop's done, it's like, okay, let's think about all of the other stuff this community needs that's not Backdrop, the product itself. The number one thing on the list here I have is Drush. This is something that I use every day on all of my Drupal sites, and I will be very sad if we can't use Drush or something comparable on Backdrop, preferably really soon. And so for the past few days, I did a bunch of reading in the Drush queue on all of the things people have said about possible ways we could make Drush work with Backdrop. And the good news is that the Drush maintainers have been looking for a way to abstract the Drupal out of Drush for a while. And they merged one patch back in July that started to do that process. It re-implemented things where it's got kind of a Drupal boot phase, and it's got trying to figure out where to do things before it does them. It's not completely ready, though. That it still needs to be refactored a little bit. So we talked with Greg Anderson. He gave us some great suggestions on how the refactoring should be done. And then we also need to add a system for Drush to recognize what system it's running on. So if it's Drupal, it will figure out whether it's Drupal 6 or Drupal 7 or Drupal 8. If it's Backdrop, it will know it's not Drupal, and it'll operate more like it does for Drupal 7. And so we have kind of a clear set of tasks defined now in terms of getting it done. And we've got someone who's volunteered to work on cleaning up Drush this weekend. So I think after this weekend, we'll have a much better idea of how much work is involved, if we can get it close, and how, if we can get a timeline for, when we think we can have that ready. But the good news is that it's not insurmountable. There are changes we can put into Drush that the Drush maintainers like, which would then allow us to put changes into Backdrop that would make Backdrop work with Drush. So Backdrop will basically include a drush.inc file that will say, hey, I'm Backdrop, and this is where you can find all of my functions, and this is what should happen when you type, drush cache clear all. And so I think it's a great path forward, and there's a lot of hope for getting Backdrop support in Drush without having to fork Drush. So, and something that Drush maintainers will want to maintain. If we need to get a Backdrop person on the team, we could probably worry about that too. But it looks right now that that's not necessary. So that's super exciting. Yay! So the next thing that I think we need to start thinking about is getting update checking for Backdrop. So this is update module. Its usual process on a Drupal site would be to check from your Drupal instance with Drupal.org to figure out update.drupal.org to figure out if your core is up to date and if your contrib modules are up to date. And with Backdrop, we've implemented an update server, and in Backdrop, the update service checks with the server, but the server just says, actually, the thing you're asking for is not implemented, and returns a message. So if you go to your status report on a Backdrop site today, it'll say update's not implemented. And so what we need to do is implement that. We need to actually make the update server capable of checking your core version of Backdrop and saying you're running Backdrop 1.0 or 1.0.1 or whatever it is, and feed that information back to the user, and then notify them if that is not the latest version. So that's step one, and I think we could probably do that at any time if anyone wanted to work on that now. But the next thing we need to do, and this is a little bit trickier, is figure out how to make that update module recognize your contrib projects and check to see if they're up to date. And so there's a bunch of steps involved in the second part, and that is number one, making sure that our contributed modules have a process of defining their versions. So on Drupal.org, the version was automatically packaged with the tarball that you downloaded. The version string was in there. It was added by Drupal, and it was based on a tag. On GitHub, we don't have that same feature built in. It is possible that we could add that so that when you get those zip files off of GitHub, they might already contain a version string based on a tag. I think that would probably be the best path forward for us because it works a lot similar to the way people did things on Drupal.org. But that's kind of a, it requires a lot of steps in order for us to get there. So what we were thinking is that maybe short term what we should do is have contributed module authors actually hard code in that version string to their info file and commit that. And it's a pain in the butt because when you come out with a new version, you've got to remember to update the info file, and nobody's ever going to do that. But I think for the first versions of modules, that might be satisfactory, and it'll buy us enough time to build the bundler tool that we want on GitHub, or at least figure out if that's possible. So that's where we are on that. Once we have that version string in there, we also need to get the update service to read the version string from your current Drupal site, which it can probably do already, but then from your backdrop site. But then it also needs to check that against the current latest version of that module. And that's also going to be a little bit harder because it's going to need to figure out the repository for that module and what the version is that's related to that repository. So if we are able to do this based on tags, that would be ideal because we could get that tag from GitHub. But if we aren't able to do that based on tags and it has to read it from the info file, there's a little bit more work where it would need to find the repository, look in the source code, pull out the version string, and then check it that way. So there's a little bit of magic involved in trying to get that to work. So yeah, we need to figure out how to get that going. Also, speaking of magic things we need to do on GitHub, we need to figure out how to register a GitHub service so that someone creates a contributed module or theme. They can edit the settings for that project, check a box saying this is a project specifically for Backdrop. And then that way our update service will be able to check for Backdrop projects. Our primary API website will be able to pull in Backdrop projects. And we'll just be able to build listings, like easier to browse listings of modules or themes or layouts or anything on Backdrop's primary website. But right now, we have no way of determining which projects on GitHub are Backdrop projects other than the ones that are in the Backdrop contrib group. So even though that is where we want contributed projects to live, there are going to be plenty of people who just create their own things and they don't want to be part of contrib, they don't want to maintain it. This is the equivalent of a sandbox project on Drupal today. And we want to be able to, for people to still be able to list those so that they can be found through the Backdrop website, although they would come up as a sandbox project rather than as an official project. So we need to get that implemented as well. And that actually doesn't look like a lot of work. There's some great documentation on GitHub that talks about how to create a GitHub service. You basically just fork their project, add your service, and then create a pull request. So it is a different language than we're used to using, but it is not a terrible amount of work. Okay, so the next thing we need to work on is the API reference website. I talked about this a little bit in our design meeting earlier today too. We know the design on that website needs a little bit of work. The sticky point there is that we want to port both Backdrop's primary website and Backdrop's API site to Backdrop. And we're working on that right now. That process involves porting a bunch of modules. We've already got Code Filter. We've already got the API module. We're working through all of the other ones we're using. Getting them ported over to Backdrop. Then we'll port the sites over to Backdrop, and then we'll build a Backdrop version of the primary website's theme, and then we'll adapt that for the API site. So we're a couple of steps away. We are working on it. We know the API site is not the most beautiful thing to look at, but it's functional, and we are making improvements to content as we go along. So yeah, we'll figure out how to get the API site cleaned up here pretty soon. It currently contains a bunch of change records. I think most of them are pretty good. We might need a review on some of them. And I think we made 2 API changes last Thursday, right before we released, or we did 2 things that required change notices that probably haven't been created. So I think that's all we know in terms of what's missing from the API site. We've also started moving all of the developer documentation off of the primary website and onto the API site. So in a perfect world, the primary website will contain a user guide, something like, oh, you have a Backdrop website, click this button, that kind of instructions. Whereas the API site will contain, you want to write a module, you want to write a theme, you want to write a layout, you want to know our coding standards, you want to know how to create a pull request. All of the documentation that's specifically for developers will live on the API site, and hopefully that'll help people know where to find something and figure out what belongs on which site. So we are starting to work on some developer documentation there. We've got a couple of really great starts on posts for those three things: how to create a module, theme, and layout, as well as some really great starts on how to port your modules and themes from Drupal. Porting layouts is going to be a whole other bag of worms, because we're going to have versions for, you know, Omega-based layouts versus panels-based layouts, but we'll get it figured out, and we'll get it all documented eventually. So API website's underway. I think for the most part, we're pretty happy with it in terms of content, but it is being updated every day. Our primary website, for the most part, is kind of in a we're happy with it holding pattern. The documentation could use some updates, so if anyone finds anything that's out of date on there, let us know. We'll update it pretty quickly. It needs some more user guide pages. Like, the one thing that bothers me is there's no concepts you need to know in Backdrop. Something that is also kind of missing in Drupal land, but like, what is a block versus what is a layout versus what is a field? Really basic things, and I think it would be great to have a user guide of that level, even more than how to install a module or how to install a theme, because those all tie together. So we'll work on that as well. And then, yeah, the other thing that's on our agenda in the near future is the how to find a module or how to find a theme or how to find a layout pages. We have temporary holding pages for those that say coming soon, so if you need to write documentation that links to them, you can. But they don't actually list modules, themes, or layouts from GitHub yet. Of course, based on our needing a GitHub service. So we'll get that done as well. All right, so that's where we are on all of the stuff that Backdrop also needs. I actually should probably add something here about forums too. There's been a lot of noise in the issue queue about creating a place for people to talk about Backdrop, and not necessarily issues, right? We already have a place in issue queue where people can ask questions about specific modules or report problems, but this is something that, you know, maybe the average person using Backdrop doesn't have a GitHub account. They're not going to go think to look in the GitHub queue to ask a question. They're going to search somewhere on the internet and be like, whatever, I need to figure this out about Backdrop. And so it would be nice if we had a place where they could go to get answers to those questions. And we have a really long thread about what to use and a really long list of possible options, none of which are great, but none of which are really that horrible either. I think short term, we want to avoid adding more stuff to Backdrop's website just because we want to avoid the additional development and support and maintenance that comes along with that, especially at scale. Like right now, it's not a big deal because there aren't that many of us, but 2 years from now, we don't want to be creating significant costs because of eating our own dog food. That said, we definitely do not want to support, maintain, or build something that is not made of Backdrop. So I think anything like Discourse that we can't get hosted, that we would have to host ourselves, is completely off the table. So if we are going to develop and build and maintain it ourselves, it will be Backdrop, but ideally that is not what we want either. So that limits us to existing forum software that we could get for free, which none of which is super great, but there are some good examples out there. Or maybe existing forum software that we could qualify for some kind of nonprofit account with. Backdrop, we have a Backdrop Foundation. We are not officially a nonprofit yet. We have a application pending with the Free Software Conservancy where we're trying to get kind of under their nonprofit umbrella, but they have kind of a backlist of projects that all want to be part of them, and they only review them once a month, and so it's kind of a long process. So right now we don't actually have any legal ground to stand on as a nonprofit, so we would need to find a company that would say, oh, you know, free for open source rather than free for nonprofit. That's something we could leverage there. So we will see. We have talked about Stack Overflow. I think that's something that's going to happen anyway. People are going to ask questions on Stack Overflow, and people are going to get answers. One of the things we wanted to do was create a backdrop-specific Stack Overflow, kind of like Drupal answers. And that is something that is really hard, trying to get your own version of that. Kevin, I think, mentioned that too, that there's a ridiculous process in trying to get your own one of those. So we will let everyone ask and answer questions on Stack Overflow. We had originally decided to just send everyone there and like tag issues with it, but there's also some usability issues with you need to have a certain amount of credit before you can ask a question. You need to have more credit before you can answer a question. Maybe you can answer right away, but you need to have more credit to like add a comment. It's kind of a weird experience for someone who's not already an expert at Stack Overflow. So if you're a client that has a website and you have a question, it's a great place to go and read answers, but it's a really hard place to get your own questions answered. So it'll happen naturally anyway. We'll let it happen naturally, but it might be good to consider another tool that is easier for people to get to. What that actually means, who knows? So we have a couple of options. We could sign up for some random piece of forum software. We could just tell people to use Stack Overflow and get over it. We could use a Google group. Luke set up a mailing list already through Google Groups, which works, I think, great for people who understand mailing lists. I think people who are new to technology these days do not think mailing lists. People who have history in technology do. So there's kind of a philosophical divide there on that. I think today everybody just Googles for everything. So having something, I know, trying to get access to a Google group mailing list that's posted on the internet can be really difficult because of the way people's emails add, ugly markers to try and determine whose email is whose and how long the thread is and whatever. It can get a little messy. But we need something. So let's see. I don't remember the issue. Does anyone happen to know what GitHub that issue is off the top of their heads? So I'd like to give people the way in on it. I don't have it handy. Anyway, I'll find it and I'll post a link in the agenda after the meeting if no one else gets to it before then. So yeah, we need to figure out some easy way for people to ask and answer questions. Right now, our only tool for that is the question tag in the GitHub queue. So if you have a question, that's where you would go to ask it. We also have IRC if you are super nerdy and know how to get on IRC. We have Twitter. People ask questions on Twitter sometimes. But none of these are really great solutions for this problem. So thanks, Kevin, for that link to Sophistrum. I'll take a look at that, too. They apparently just got their 75% on Stack Exchange, so it's great. Reddit. Yeah, we'll try and figure out some solution. I think at this point, if we just choose one, it doesn't matter if it's not perfect. We can choose one. We can try it for a couple of months. We can see what people like and don't like about it, and we have the opportunity to change. It is sometimes hard to change later depending on how much activity happens there, but I think if we find serious shortcomings with whichever decision we make, it would be wise to change. So we can figure that out. All right, back to the agenda. What else here? Let's talk about Backdrop the software. Okay, so let's see. We have 1.0.1 out. We have a milestone for 1.0.2, which is what we're working on next. Those are bugs. We also have a milestone for 1.1.0. So as we're finding issues that we think definitely need to be in the next bug fix release, we'll tag it with a milestone. As we come across issues we think need to be in the next major or minor release, we'll tag it with that issue. If you have something, and I think that in theory, anyone who creates a pull request should have access to fiddle with labels and milestones and stuff on the issue queue GitHub repository, but I'm not entirely sure that's working. So if you are someone who spends a lot of time in the issue queue and you want access to these things, just let us know. And if you haven't been granted access already, we can give it to you. Or if you haven't created a pull request, but you are really super active in the issue queue and want to have access anyway, that's fine. We're open up to anyone, and we're going to try and at some point build a tool that just gives you a button that says, let me edit these things, and it'll grant themselves access. We don't need the restrictions that GitHub automatically applies or applies for this particular repository. That's why we have a separate repository for issues. It's because we want to let everyone have access to edit them. So if you have any problems trying to edit milestones or labels or anything, let us know. And then we're pretty good about actively checking the milestone lists of issues to make sure that all of the bugs have pull requests, those pull requests get reviewed quickly, that sort of thing. We're not so good at looking at the meta list of issues. So if you find a way to slice and dice that list of issues to find exactly what you want to work on, that's definitely good. We do keep an eye on things that are posted recently. If you want someone to look specifically at an issue, put their name in it, because at least Nate and I have it set up to email us if someone's name is mentioned. I think most people do. So that's a good way to get attention on your issue if you need feedback from a particular person. Okay, so yeah, for 1.1.0, we have built-in rich text editor, token module, path auto module. I want to get the theme, admin theme changes in, whether it's 7 or new admin theme, just so that it starts to feel like a different product in Drupal. And then we've got other stuff going on, like a bunch of user experience issues, a bunch of developer experience issues, and of course, bugs as they need to get fixed. So today, after this meeting, we're going to have a little sprint in IRC, as with every Thursday, where we'll be able to kind of crank through a couple of these new issues. Maybe we'll get a resolution for the forum option. Luke found the issue. It is in the backdropcms.org queue, issue number 18, if you want to look there for that. And then upcoming things we have at Sand Camp, which is here in the end of February. We're going to have a super session, like a 2-hour session where we talk about Backdrop. We're trying to get a training. I'm not sure there's still room to offer extra trainings, but we've got Darius and Izzy want to do a training there, so that'll be really cool. And then I'm not sure they're doing any sprinting. I think the camp is just Friday, Saturday, and ends. But that's our plan for that. And then we'll also be at Mid-Camp in March in Chicago. Chicago in March, nice and cold. Nice change from San Diego, for sure. And it's mostly, I think, going to be a Drupal-focused conference, so we're probably not going to have a sprint. We have offered to sponsor the sprint if they're going to have one. But we haven't heard back from them on whether they're interested in doing that or not. If they are, we'll be sprinting. I'm not sure what their plans are, but we'll see how we can try and make that work. So lots of stuff coming up on the schedule. We also have a post-release Backdrop CMS article coming out in Drupal Watchdog, which I think will be out later this spring. So that'll be really fun. That's something I'm working on. And just in general, if anyone wants to make any noise about Backdrop, now is a great time to do it. Everybody seems to be super excited trying it out for the first time. If you find any problems, obviously let us know. We're still working out some of the kinks, particularly around CMI stuff. We need more testing on that. So that's the most fun, I think, trying new toys. But yeah, so that's all I have for the agenda today. Thank you all for joining. Did you have any comments or questions or anything you guys want to add today? Nice and quiet. All right, well, thank you for joining. If there's anything we talked about today that you guys really want to work on, you can let us know in IRC or in the issue queue or what have you, and we'll try and help as much as possible. I'll try and find Nate and see if he's interested in working on Backdrop today in our sprint as well. But all right, thanks everybody for coming, and we'll see you next week.